sinking of the Titanic in 1912 was a tragedy that claimed the lives of nearly 1,500 people. But it wasn't only human lives that were lost to the icy water. Aboard that ill-fated voyage were personal treasures, some of immense monetary value, others just steeped in sentimental worth. Around 2,200 people boarded the great ship, and they took with them the personal effects that made up their daily lives. For some, like those in first class, these were simply expensive but cherished trinkets. But for others down in steerage, it was literally all they had. But one thing I often get asked about is what were the most expensive items that were lost with the Titanic? From priceless jewels, technological marvels, and even an infamous book. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today we're going to explore some of the most valuable items lost and found in the sinking of the Titanic. The voyage of the Titanic meant different things to different people on board. For some, it was an opportunity at a whole new life, but for others, it was the most luxurious means of conveyance home after a relaxed vacation in Europe. Now, the sheer excitement of a ship's maiden voyage was a magnet for some pretty unique individuals and characters who brought along with them their belongings that matched their stature. Now, of course, within days, many of the personal belongings and treasures that boarded the ship at Southampton, Cherbourg, and Queenstown would find their final resting places nearly 4 kilometers below the ocean's surface. Madeline Talmadge Astor sat at the edge of lifeboat number 4, her heart gripped by both relief and despair. At just 19 years old and 5 months pregnant, she had watched her husband, John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, disappear into the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Astor was not just any man, he was a titan of real estate, a member of one of America's most renowned and wealthy families, but he was also an inventor and a science fiction writer. His personal wealth at the time was estimated at $87 million, which would today be around $2.75 billion. Now, the Astors had been on an extended holiday on a honeymoon in Europe, a trip that was taken partly to escape the scrutiny of their scandalous marriage. Astor was 47, and Madeline was just 18 when they were wed. In fact, she was actually younger than Astor's eldest son. Their return to America on the Titanic was supposed to begin this next chapter in their lives because Madeline was pregnant. Now, Astor had a deep love for Madeline. He showered her with lavish gifts, and it was very clearly evident in the jewelry she carried aboard the Titanic. This was a collection of diamonds and pearls worth millions. Now, it's hard to know exactly how much these jewels were worth. Some stated that they were priceless, but there are some things we definitely know for sure. For example, we know that her diamond solitaire engagement ring was supposedly, at the time, $25,000, which today would be $790,000. Now, she had a $250,000 pearl necklace and a gilded menagerie of sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. So it's safe to assume that if she did lose any in the sinking of the Titanic, they would have been worth an extremely large sum. But the only thing is, we don't know what was saved and what was lost. Even in her mourning, Madeline wore some of the jewelry that Astor had given her, including a diamond-encrusted choker and pearls. Now, if Astor saved all her jewelry that night before getting into the lifeboat, as some other first-class women did, then she must have kept them the rest of her life. So she did, in fact, leave some jewels to her son when she passed away, including a solitaire diamond ring and a pearl necklace. But whether these were the ones from John Jacob or her subsequent husbands remains to be investigated. If she didn't save some of her spectacular jewels, then presumably they're still down there, buried under layers of silt and debris, unlikely to ever be seen again. Among the rarities aboard the Titanic was a one-of-a-kind book made famous today by a legendary video game. But what many don't know is this prop from Titanic Adventure Out of Time was actually based on the real thing. It was an extremely rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, an 11th century Persian collection of poetry bound in Moroccan leather and decorated with gold and encrusted with nearly 1,500 precious gems, including rubies, emeralds, and topaz. Now, the binding was considered by experts to be the most ambitious of its kind in history, and it took its creators 2 years to accomplish. The Rubaiyat is a philosophical work that speaks to the fragility of life, fate, and the brevity of human existence, so it's more than fitting that it found a place aboard Titanic, even though it did so entirely by chance. This particular copy had been auctioned in London before being purchased by a mysterious collector named Gabriel Weiss, who had an eye for rare and valuable artifacts. But he got it for an absolute bargain, thanks to the effects of the coal strike that had brought Britain's markets to a near standstill in 1912. Vice picked it up for just £405, a sum that equates to roughly £44,000 today, or about $60,000. Yes, it's an impressive sum, but it was thought that the book was actually worth 3 times that at the time, about $180,000. The auction house, Sotheby's, consigned the Rubaiyat carefully. They packed it and protected it, and they sent it on one of the few ships that was actually crossing the Atlantic that month, Titanic. Being the newest luxury liner in the world, the White Star Line had diverted precious coal from other ships so that she could actually complete her maiden voyage. So passengers who had bookings on other liners were moved over, and then the Rubaiyat found its way on board too, likely in a dedicated book storage, which was right at the very stern of the ship in a hold just above the propellers. Now this area is still intact on the wreck, but it's buried deep into the mud at the bottom of the ocean. In theory, the Rubaiyat could be in excellent condition because leather has been known to survive down there quite well. We know where it is, we just have no real way to get there. So what if we could? Well, auctioneering experts think the value could be into the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Now, in contrast to this beautiful binding of 11th century art, another masterpiece was lost that night in April 1912 that was of a more mechanical nature. In the bows of the Titanic's cargo hold, towards the bow, was another symbol of luxury and affluence, an elegant Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville. This car, which had been purchased by the wealthy American couple William Carter and Sally Carter during their travels in Europe, was a surefire sign of their success and their refined taste. In 1912, cars were relatively rare, and Henry Ford's Model T was just beginning to gain traction as a more viable, affordable tool for the masses. Until then, the automobile had been the plaything of the rich and the famous. So to reflect that, many early cars still featured separate driver and occupant compartments like carriages of the 19th century had. The Renault CB Coupe de Ville was a technological marvel of its time, and of course, for the Carters, once they got it back to the US, their exotic, European, beautiful red and gold vehicle would have turned a lot of heads. It's thought the car was the only automobile aboard Titanic, and it was kept down in one of the forward holds. Some also think that it might have been inside a sealed crate, which means that a famous scene from a certain film may not have actually been possible. When Titanic sank and the Renault went with it, Carter filed a $5,000 claim, which would today be worth about $160,000. Now, just recently, the same model of car was auctioned off in 2008 for nearly $400,000 of today's money. So were Carter's original car to be recovered as one of the most unique vehicles in history, it would probably fetch value well into the millions. Save for one small issue, it probably doesn't exist anymore. The thin bodywork will have essentially been eaten through, and its chassis, if it was made of wood, like many were back then, would have collapsed. It's likely that the rubber tyres might still be down there, and some of the brass fittings as well, but that's all that likely remains of this once magnificent machine. Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, and his wife Ida were another couple aboard the Titanic whose loss is remembered not just because of their staggering wealth, but for their unwavering devotion to each other. Isidore was one of the most successful businessmen in America at the time, having turned Macy's department store into a household name. He'd served as a US congressman and was a philanthropist known for his generous contributions to various causes that were close to his heart. He was known as a man of humility and integrity, and he and his wife Ida had been married together for over 40 years. The couple had been traveling in Europe and were returning to America aboard Titanic. They brought with them many valuable belongings, including Ida's jewelry. Now, both Ida and Isidore were tragically lost when Titanic sank, as they famously refused to be separated from one another. With them went everything they'd brought aboard Titanic. Now, it's thought many of Ida's jewels were lost with the ship. We just don't know which ones, so it's hard to get a bead on exactly what kind of value went down with Titanic. We can get some clue from the jewels that she left behind when they had to go through her estate. Among her possessions were a guard chain of gold, set with 12 diamonds and 12 oriental pearls, a brooch with 31 diamonds alone, a hairpin of amber with a scroll of platinum and gold mounted with 125 diamonds, and a platinum brooch containing 130 diamonds and 8 pearls. Now, the value of these items, adjusted for inflation, would be well over $100,000 in today's value. Now, this gives us some insight into the potential worth of the jewelry and belongings that were lost on Titanic. Because first-class ladies were expected to dress lavishly for dinner, Ida would have been carrying some of her finest with her and it almost survived. She'd actually handed it to her personal maid who'd got into a lifeboat, but then Ida took it back off her. When the time came for the Strausses to board their own lifeboat, Ida famously refused to leave her husband. "Where you go, I go," she said, and the two were last seen embracing side by side on a bench. Titanic itself carried many pieces of fine art for display in the first-class spaces. But down in the ship's hold, she carried artworks loaded by passengers for transport to America, and one of these was particularly valuable. Le Circassien Urbain was a masterpiece by the French artist Marie-Joseph Blondel, completed in 1814. It was an oil nude of a woman bathing. Now, interestingly, when it was first exhibited in Paris, observers criticised the twist in the woman's body, as well as the composition as compared to Blondel's other works. But by the time Titanic was preparing for a maiden voyage, a century had passed. The painting had come to be seen as a very fine example of Blondel's work. It was bought by a Swedish businessman, Mr. Moritz Björnstrom Steffensen, who boarded Titanic in first class with his precious painting in tow. Now, on the night of the sinking, he was fortunate enough to survive, boarding a lifeboat after assisting with the loading of others before him. When it came time to lodge financial claims for lost goods, Björnstrom Steffensen lodged an eye-watering $100,000 claim that would today come in at a whopping $3.1 million. Now, this was the single largest claim filed against the White Star Line for any one lost good or article during the disaster, and it absolutely dwarfed the claim made by the Carters for the lost Renault. Now, in the end, he was never awarded anywhere near the amount he had filed for, and Blondel's bathing woman was confined to the depths forever. Relatively little was actually known about the painting, and were it not for a handful of engravings made of it in the 1800s, then we'd have no idea of what it even looked like at all. But a century after its loss in 2014, an anonymous artist going by the moniker of John Parker completed a recreation of the artwork based on Blondel's other works, as well as the surviving engravings that gives us a rare, tantalizing glimpse at the bathing woman that went down with the Titanic. Other items that were lost with Titanic were recovered and have gained provenance and unbelievable value since 1912. Two most recently went up to auction, and the first was an iconic part of the Titanic story. Wallace Hartley was the 33-year-old bandmaster aboard Titanic, and he famously played alongside his orchestra while the ship sank to try to instill calm amongst the terrified passengers and crew. Tragically, he lost his life in the disaster, and his body was later recovered by the Mackay Bennett, the cable-laying ship, nearly 2 weeks after the sinking. He was still fully dressed, and his violin case was strapped to him. The case disappeared after the recovery, but then, after many years, in March 2013, an investigation determined that an item that had been in the possession of a British man was indeed the violin Hartley had used on the Titanic. The violin had actually been returned to Hartley's wife, and after her death in 1939, it had changed hands before resting with the same family for 70 years. Now, the violin was a gift originally from Hartley's fiancée, and it still carried her engraving to him on an inset silver plate. In 2013, an auction put the violin up for sale, and it fetched an incredible £900,000, that's $1.7 million. The violin itself is no Stradivarius, and it's damaged from its time spent in the salt water, but the historical provenance pushed its value into the hundreds of thousands. Fortunately, instead of disappearing again into a private collection, the instrument is now on display at the Belfast Titanic Museum. Now, a rare and unusual treasure has just recently been spotted mixed in with the debris down there at the Titanic wreckside. It's an unusual piece of jewellery. Now, the Edwardian appetite for adventure and all things exotic is the stuff of legends, and loaded into Titanic's holds were stacked boxes of unusual animal samples like pig tusks and things like that. But recently, underwater scans and video footage have revealed one case to have split open, revealing a necklace made from a huge shark tooth. Now, this triangular tooth looks to have come from a great white, but many think or speculate it's actually from a Carcharodon megalodon, the giant ancient shark species. Now, the tooth was believed to be part of the personal collection of an affluent American passenger with a passion for paleontology and collecting rare items. Now, both then and now, megalodon fossils, especially the teeth, have always been highly coveted among collectors thanks to their rarity and the sheer awe that they inspire as remnants of one of the largest marine predators in Earth's history. The necklace it was attached to still sits on the sea floor, and it's unlikely to be recovered. Today, items recovered from the Titanic wreck can't be sold individually at auction, but if it did, the necklace would probably fetch the hundreds of thousands of dollars and likely become the most expensive shark tooth in history. Now, one final special item is worth talking about. Remember John Jacob Astor, the millionaire who stayed behind while his wife escaped the sinking ship? Well, his body was one of the few actually recovered after his life was lost when the ship sank, and inside his pocket was found a fine gold pocket watch, still with his initials, JJA, elaborately decorating the cover. Now, the pocket watch was returned, still water damaged, to his son Vincent in 1912, who had it repaired and then wore it himself the rest of his life. This tragic little piece of history went up for auction in 2023. And in fact, I watched that auction. I even bought a couple of small, cheap things, and I could not believe my eyes as the watch began to be bid on. By the end, it had sold for £1.17 million. That's $1.5 million. Sadly, unlike the Hartley violin though, it seems destined to disappear into a private collection, where it will remain a small reminder of the horrible, dark night the Titanic went down. Lusitania, the pride of Britain's Cunard Line, one of the finest ships of her day, a kind of floating celebrity. The ship's stellar career was cut tragically short in 1915. At the height of the First World War, she was sunk by a submarine attack that left hundreds dead. In some ways, she was forgotten and chalked up as just one more wartime casualty. While many are familiar with the story of the sinking of Lusitania, we've covered this on the channel in detail before, the ship has many more stories to tell us. From the priceless artifacts lost in her sinking to the early discovery of the wreck and the attempts at salvaging the great ship. First, let's quickly recap the day Lusitania was dramatically and so tragically lost. On May 7th, 1915, Lusitania was steaming 11 nautical miles off the coast of Ireland. She had departed from New York City and was en route to Liverpool, steaming with nearly 2,000 souls aboard. Passengers had been warned of the danger of sailing in the ocean war zone that surrounded the UK, but suddenly, with land and home in sight, the German submarine U-20 fired a single torpedo which struck her starboard side. The violent impact was followed soon after by a second explosion from deep within the ship. Lusitania sank in just 18 minutes, taking 1,195 people with her, including 123 Americans. The sinking was not the reason the US entered the war 2 years later, but it did turn public opinion in many countries against the Germans. Depictions of the attack and subsequent sinking were used heavily in US and British propaganda and military recruitment campaigns. But the dirty little secret that the British Admiralty had kept was that while Lusitania was still a passenger ship at the time of her sinking, she was also carrying around 173 tons of war material, including 4.2 million rounds of rifle ammunition and thousands of shell casings and fuses. Germany argued that Lusitania was using passengers as human shields to avoid submarine attacks, all while carrying war supplies, and some claim that the second explosion that contributed to the rapid sinking of the ship proved she was indeed carrying extra undeclared ammunition. Lusitania was sent to the bottom of the Celtic Sea with hundreds of her passengers, but it wasn't just human lives that were lost that day, because it just so happens aboard Lusitania had been some pretty rare and unusual items that were bound for Europe, but destined to rot on the bottom of the sea instead. Although there are no reports of a lost Renault like on Titanic, which we previously discussed in the Titanic's most expensive lost treasures video, Lusitania sank with some priceless items of her own, and interestingly, a good portion of these can be attributed to one passenger. Charles Laureate was a bookseller from Boston, and with him aboard Lusitania was Charles Dickens' personal copy of his own book, A Christmas Carol. The book actually contained handwritten notes jotted by Dickens relating to his 1844 copyright suit against the illicit republishing of his story, and despite the book's obvious historical and financial value, Laureate didn't insure it, figuring the chance of Lusitania sinking was nil. Laureate also carried with him drawings by William Makepeace Thackeray, an English novelist and illustrator. In his time, Thackeray was regarded as the only possible rival to fellow author Dickens. He was known for his satirical works, and his most popular publication was the novel Vanity Fair, which painted a portrait of British society at the time. As an illustrator, Thackeray was a master of caricature and the quick sketch. Laureate was carrying scrapbooks with him on Lusitania, one containing 54 line drawings by Thackeray and the other with 64 others. When the torpedo struck the ship, Laureate quickly grabbed his leather briefcase, which contained the Dickens book, but left his collection of Thackeray sketches behind in his cabin. He rushed up to the boat deck and saw a lifeboat being loaded with women and children. Laureate jumped in, but as the lifeboat began to be dragged down by the ship, he dove into the sea instead. In the struggle to save his life, Laureate lost the briefcase containing the book, and it was ripped from his hands. He did manage to survive though, narrowly evading entanglement with an antenna and swimming to a collapsible lifeboat. While Laureate lost his treasured items, he did manage to save the photographs of his young child that he had with him, but most importantly, he had his life. In 1922, 7 years after the sinking of Lusitania, Laureate filed a claim against the German government for the loss of the Dickens book and the Thackeray drawings in excess of $51,000, for which he was ultimately awarded just $10,000. While it famously took about 73 years for the wreck of Titanic to be found after multiple different attempts, the wreck of the Lusitania was found relatively quickly. The ship was discovered on October 6, 1935, just 20 years or so after the disaster, thanks to the relative certainty of her last location and the much shallower sea depth. She was discovered by the crew of the salvage steamer Orphea after 3 months of searching. Using a depth sounder, they found she was nearly 12 miles or 19 kilometres out from the old Kinsale Head in Ireland, lying on her starboard side at about a 30-degree angle in approximately 305 feet or nearly 93 metres of water. Then, 3 weeks after discovering Lusitania's location, diver Jim Jarrett was lowered to the wreck wearing an atmospheric diving suit or ADS, which maintains pressure internally, providing the diver from dangerous underwater pressures and eliminating the need for decompression. The suit alone weighed over 1,000 pounds. That's about 453 kilograms. The design of the suit allowed the diver to move freely and was more than capable of withstanding the water pressure found at the wreck site. It meant that Lusitania could be seen again with human eyes long before the likes of Titanic. With the ship's location now known and the wreck within reach, it didn't take long for salvage plans to come forward. Between 1931 and 1935, an American syndicate, including Simon Lake, submarine inventor, and US Navy officer H.H. Rainey, negotiated a contract with the British Admiralty. They intended to build a 200-foot-long steel tube, 5 feet in diameter, with an enclosed set of stairs and a dive chamber at the bottom. The contraption would be floated over the Lusitania wreck and then sunk in the upright position. The tube would be fixed to rest on the main deck of the Lusitania. From the surface, the divers would take the stairs down to the dive chambers and exit out directly onto the ship. The primary goal of the mission was to salvage the purses, safe, and the other items of historical value, but unfortunately, thanks to Lake's company going through difficult financial issues, the contract with the British authorities expired on December 31st, 1935, before any salvage attempts were ever made. Surprisingly, they did get as far as building and testing the tube. The Second World War halted any further salvage attempts on the Lusitania, and after some lengthy time out of the spotlight, the wreck was rediscovered in the 1960s by US Navy diver John Light. He conducted over 40 dives to the wreck using nothing more than basic scuba equipment and only breathing compressed air. Given the water temperature and low visibility at the wreck site, as well as the water pressure, Light's lucky to have survived his many dives. Witnesses say each time he returned to the surface, he looked as pale as a ghost. I don't blame him. Light attempted to photograph the wreck, but any lighting equipment he managed to bring down with him was crushed under the pressure. Reportedly, he was able to take some pictures using lights lowered from the surface, but dangling ropes and cables presented serious hazards to the divers. The ownership of the wreck was picked up in 1967 by the Liverpool War Risk Insurance Association, who paid off the original owners of the insurance claim. The same year, the organisation held a silent auction to find a new owner. John Light, fresh off his several dives to Lusitania, won the auction with a £1,000 bid. That's just 15,000 of today's pounds. After the purchase, Light was looking for funding to lead a salvage operation. He partnered with George Macoma, who also recruited American businessman Greg Bemis to form a partnership aimed at bringing Lusitania partially to the surface again, but it wouldn't last long. Light's venture collapsed, leaving Macoma and Bemis as the only remaining owners of the wreck site. Now, not much of note happened over the next 50 years or so. In fact, Bemis had apparently almost completely forgotten about his 50% stake in the Lusitania. By 1982, though, Bemis had really started to gain appreciation for Lusitania's story. Originally, his investment was motivated by financial gain, hoping to salvage the ship's precious cargo of copper, bronze, and silver. Now he was more interested in the events of the sinking and the questions within. Why did the ship sink so quickly? What caused the second explosion? Was the British government involved in a cover-up? By this time, diving technology had improved dramatically, and Bemis hoped to start a new salvage operation in an attempt to answer these questions. His remaining partner, Makoma, was wary of the financial liability and, having experienced his own heavy financial losses, willingly gave Bemis his 50% share in 1982 for just $1. While Bemis may have developed a personal relationship with Lusitania, it didn't mean that her wreck would be left alone. Far from it, in fact. In both the 1982 and 1983 expeditions, teams descended down to Lusitania for extensive salvage. The operations and subsequent auctions of artifacts would be used to fund exploratory dives to the wreck in the future. The Oceanliner Company cut away anchors, 3 propellers, and also dragged up a foghorn, a bridge telegraph, the ship's bell, and many items of cutlery. Some of these artifacts are on display around the world today, but others are missing. The propellers in particular have certainly ended up in an assortment of weird locations. One is on display at the Pierhead in Liverpool, understandably, in front of the Maritime Museum, as a memorial to the wreck. The second propeller has found its way, oddly enough, to the sculpture garden of the Hilton Anatole Hotel in Dallas, Texas, for whatever reason. But stranger yet, the third propeller is rumoured to have been melted down and refashioned into an expensive series of golf clubs. Now, Bemis' search to answer some of Lusitania's secrets caught the eye of local government. Declassified files from the British Ministry of Defence and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office show they were worried that the 1982 expedition would find actual evidence that the second explosion was caused by a secret cargo of munitions. This was despite the fact that Britain's official stance on the matter at the time was that Lusitania wasn't carrying any such cargo at all. They also feared that any further munitions on the wreck site could explode and create an international incident. Ultimately, the positioning of Lusitania on her side, where the torpedo had struck, leaves a lot of questions still unanswered even today. In 2008, 4 million rounds of small arms munitions were found on board, but this was technically permitted at the time of Lusitania's sinking. Bemis did not get his answers, nor was anything found that the British government was fearful of. In the 1990s, Bemis invited Dr. Robert Ballard, who found Titanic's wreck with his team, to conduct research on the Lusitania. This resulted in a 1993 National Geographic expedition, as well as a documentary. The wreck was explored via a mini-sub, and Dr. Ballard concluded that the second explosion was most likely caused by coal dust, which Bemis dismissed as a crazy idea. Now, one rumour that the Lusitania cannot shake is the use of depth charges over the wreck. That during the Second World War, the Royal Navy had either used it for target practice during training, or had bombed it to try and ward off submarines that might be hiding within its sonar shadow. Depth charges are essentially just large drums packed with explosives, and they're set to explode at a certain depth after they're dropped over the side of a ship. A more cynical theory is that the British government purposely depth charged the wreck to hide the evidence the ship was carrying more munitions than reported. Multiple theories aside, no government has ever actually stepped forward and admitted to using Lusitania as a target for any reason. While not trying to give too much credence to conspiracy theories, it should be noted that unexploded depth charges have been spotted around the wreck by multiple dives. The wreck itself is in truly decrepit condition. She's now completely on her starboard side and almost entirely flattened, as her hull members have now completely given up. The currents in that part of the sea are extremely strong, which accounts for much of the damage, but one can't help but wonder if the process was sped along by depth charge damage. Personally, I'm not sure I believe Lusitania was used for target practice. I certainly don't think it was attacked on purpose. It would be interesting to research British destroyer and corvette records off the coast of Ireland in the Second War to see if any attacked enemy submarines in the matching coordinates. Purely by coincidence, Lusitania might have become collateral damage once again. Today, the ship rests in a murky ocean grave, covered in tattered old fishing nets. It's hard to imagine that fine ship turned into a nondescript pile of rusted steel. But what's for sure is that hidden in the wreck are many answers to the questions we still have about her loss. And maybe one day we might be able to solve some of Lusitania's most enduring mysteries. Gold. For centuries it has captured the human imagination. Of course, during the great age of exploration, mountains of it were discovered, prospected and looted, and the only way to get it back to the mother country was by ship. Over hundreds of years, countless ships went missing or were destroyed, carrying tons of treasure. Some have been found, leading to lengthy court battles as different parties stake their claim. But others are still out there, undiscovered at the bottom of the ocean, waiting for some lucky group to stumble across them and make a fortune. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and here are 4 of history's most valuable shipwrecks. The City of Cairo. Now, when people think of sunken treasures and lost fortunes, their minds probably turn to the golden age of sail and pirate ships. But the truth is that a great number of modern shipwrecks and steamships have disappeared carrying a fortune in gold and silver, and one of them was the SS City of Cairo. The ship was built during the First World War, a humbly sized passenger ship for the Ellerman Line, around 450 feet or 137 metres long, and 8,000 gross registered tons. She had an uneventful career until 1929, when the ship hit and sank a tug with its propeller. But unfortunately for the handsome ship City of Cairo, things were only going to get worse. Requisitioned during the Second World War as a supply ship, she was tasked with ferrying cargo to Britain through waters infested with German submarines. In October 1942, the ship set off from Bombay via South Africa, and loaded aboard were 101 passengers, including 28 women and 19 children, along with 10 gunners to man the ship's modest defences. Down below deck, though, the ship was loaded with 7,000 tons of general cargo, like iron, timber and cotton, but stored deep in the hull were also 2,000 boxes of silver coins. And we'll get back to these later. The ship sailed a zigzag course to avoid the enemy, but unfortunately her old engines were running inefficiently and smoke poured out thick from her funnel, making the ship visible for miles. At 9:36 p.m. on November the 6th, 1942, the ship's luck ran out. A single torpedo slammed into the hull and water poured in. The ship's captain ordered his vessel abandoned and the lifeboats were lowered. Remarkably, only 6 people were lost in the sinking, and all the women and children were got into the boats. Sadly, the ship's wireless radioman remained at his post to broadcast a distress signal, but a second torpedo detonated and killed him. The ship sank to the sea floor, leaving behind a few bits of wreckage and the lifeboats bobbing on the surface. But then, out of the ocean roared the conning tower of a German U-boat. The U-68, commanded by Karl Friedrich Merten, stopped alongside the lifeboats, and the German captain emerged. He chatted with the survivors in the lifeboats, asking for the ship's name, cargo, and destination. And he gave the survivors the course to the nearest land, St. Helena, some 500 miles or 800 kilometers away. With that, he said, "Good night, and sorry for sinking you," turned away, and climbed back down into his conning tower. The U-68 sailed off, and Merton thought the survivors were doomed. Over the next 3 weeks, the lifeboats battled the elements in an epic open-top voyage to St. Helena. Dozens of the survivors of the sinking died in the lifeboats from exposure, but remarkably, all the boats were rescued after they had lost contact from each other for over a month, with one even travelling close to 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometres to Brazil. Out of 302 people aboard, only 195 survived. The city of Cairo was all but forgotten until about 2011, when an expedition located the twisted hulk of the ship at a depth of 17,000 feet, more than 5 kilometers deep at the bottom of the ocean. Locked away within the hull were those 2,000 boxes of silver coins, a whopping 100 tons in total, valued today at around £35 million or $50 million. It was a fortune too sweet to pass up, and despite the challenges presented by the wreck's great depth, a salvage operation was organised. This was the deepest marine salvage exercise ever attempted. By 2013, most of the silver had been dragged 5 kilometers up from the ocean floor to see daylight again for the first time in 7 decades. The end of the story is a bit anticlimactic though. The silver rupees were recovered, then hurriedly shipped back to the UK, where they were melted down and sold, with the revenue split between the British Treasury and the salvage team. Still, it was a great achievement, the deepest recovery of treasure from a ship that was ever successfully completed. Las Cinco Chagas. The ship was a carrack, a type of sailing cargo ship, and it was sunk in a bitter battle off the Azores. Now, what it was carrying has tempted treasure hunters across the globe for decades, but it remains one of history's most alluring, unfound, forgotten shipwrecks. Cinco Chagas was built in the 1500s. She made her maiden voyage in 1593, but was found to be both overloaded and in generally poor condition. Crammed aboard her for her final voyage were around 1,400 people, including 270 slaves. She had been sent on a special mission. A secret cargo was loaded aboard that needed urgent delivery to the King of Spain and Portugal, Philip II. The Cinco Chagas set off, but global events would see the ship targeted by a bloodthirsty enemy. The English Royal Navy was hunting Spanish and Portuguese ships, as this was the height of the Anglo-Spanish War. The year earlier, the Portuguese carrack Madre de Dios had been captured in an engagement, and the British victors were shocked to discover mountains of jewels, pearls, and gold stored below in huge treasure chests. This treasure is thought to have been worth as much as half of the total English treasury at the time, and maybe the second largest treasure ever. The British Earl of Cumberland wanted in on the action, and privately funded the assembly of a small fleet to go and capture their own Portuguese and Spanish treasure ships. Out they sailed, and in June 1594, a huge Portuguese ship was spotted on the horizon. It was the Cinco Chagas. The Portuguese and British ships closed on each other and prepared for battle. At noon, they exchanged broadsides and volleys of musket fire. The fight went on all day, with the British trying to board, but the Portuguese desperately fighting them off. Then, a boarding party attacked the ship's undefended stern, and it was all over. An eyewitness remembered that the sea was purple with blood dripping from the scuppers, and the decks cluttered with the dead, and the fire raging in some parts of the ships, and the air so filled with smoke that not only we could sometimes not see each other, but we could not recognize each other. It had been a bitter fight to the end, but the British were finally in control of the ship. They began to systematically execute any surrendered or struggling Portuguese, sparing only the women and children, but then the smoke began to get thicker. The ship was burning out of control, and it had to be abandoned. The British ships were still tied alongside the Cinco Chagas, and they worked desperately to free them. And then just after dawn, the fire reached the ship's powder magazine and blew it apart. The explosion was enormous. Hundreds were killed, including 35 Englishmen who were still on board. But in the end, only 16 of those aboard Cinco Chagas had survived. Portuguese crew plucked from the ocean told the English captors a wild tale. They had been carrying a fortune, 22 treasure chests of diamonds, rubies, and pearls, and over 2 million silver coins. That would value the ship's cargo today at between $15 and $20 billion. The Cinco Chagas had been on a special mission to transport the fortune to the king, and if successful, the captain would have been made a viceroy of the Indies. The story has become legend, but the exact location of the ship's wreck has been lost to time. Estimates place it at a depth of about a mile, or just shy of 2 kilometers deep. It has attracted treasure hunters and expeditions for years. Partly owing to the depth and the fact that she was blown completely apart, the wreck and the around $20 billion of treasure remain to be found. The SS Central America. Now, this next vessel has earned the nickname of the Ship of Gold for good reason, because it was lost at the height of the Californian gold rush. Her name was the SS Central America. Central America was a 280-foot or 85-meter long paddle steamer that operated between Panama and the eastern US coast in the 1850s. After just 5 years of service, the ship set out for New York City loaded with a fortune in gold, 9 tons of it, all prospected during the Californian gold rush. It was meant to be a rudimentary voyage, but luck was not on Central America's side. On September 9th, 1857, a monster hurricane roared in with winds howling up to 105 miles per hour, or 170 kilometers per hour. The ship's sails were torn to shreds, and she labored through mountainous waves, but the sea broke over her bows and she began to take on water. Her single boiler gave out, shutting down the crucial bilge pumps that were working to get water out of the ship. But slowly, she began to settle by the stern and sink. With the sea churning around them, the crew flew a distress flag, but it was a hopeless situation. No rescue could possibly come. Passengers and crew formed a human chain with buckets, working hard to bail their ship out, but it was a losing battle. Attempts to get the boiler lit again failed, and all hope seemed lost, but then, the next morning, 2 ships were sighted in the distance. 100 passengers, mainly women and children, loaded into lifeboats and set off, but most remained behind. The storm wouldn't subside, and finally, the Central America sank, stern first. 425 people were lost. 50 survivors were plucked from the water, and over a week after the sinking, 3 more were found adrift in a lifeboat. For the time, this was one of the largest losses of life at sea in American shipping. Down with her sank almost $1 billion worth of gold. In 1988, a research effort rediscovered the lost ship and began to recover the gold from her hull. In all, some $150 million worth of the stuff was pulled up. A single ingot from the wreck sold for $8 million by itself. But then came the insurance companies, 39 of them in total, who argued that they had paid damages out back in 1857 when the ship was lost, and that they had a right to the recovered gold. What followed was a lengthy legal process of suing and countersuing. The discovery team was awarded 92% of the profits. But then, years later in 2005, the expedition leader, Tommy Thompson, was sued by his own team and investors for holding out on them. He ran away and went into hiding in 2012, put around $4 million in offshore accounts. He was located 3 years later in 2015 and extradited to Ohio. He agreed to surrender some 500 gold coins, and investors were awarded millions in compensation in 2018, some 30 years after the wreck had actually been found. The original expedition had only excavated some 5% of the ship's wreck, and tons of gold remained locked down in the hull at the bottom of the ocean. Recovery efforts are ongoing to this day, but aside from the gold, more fascinating things were pulled up from the wreck. This included a series of early photographs called ambrotypes and some other daguerreotypes featuring women and children, all perfectly preserved at the bottom of the ocean for 130 years, a haunting reminder of the human lives lost when the Central America sank. San José. Now, this next treasure ship was sunk in battle, but unlike the Cinco Chagas, her treasures have actually been found, leading to a bitter dispute over who actually owns the wreck. In 1708, the San José, a massive galleon, was a kind of warship, was serving as the flagship of a treasure fleet tasked with taking tons of gold looted from the New World back to Spain. See, Spain's galleons were purpose-built for this, with both huge holds capable of loading tons of treasure to dozens of massive cannons so they could put up a fight if intercepted. This was at the height of the War of Spanish Succession, and on June 8, 1708, the flagship San José and its fleet of 14 merchant ships lumbered into a British naval squadron. San José was one of 3 escorting warships, but they were also the biggest, so they carried the treasure between them. The British had figured that this was the case, and in the ensuing battle they actually focused their attacks on San José and the 2 others. As the battle dragged on, one of the treasure-laden Spanish escort galleons escaped into the night, leaving the San José and the only other escort to stave off the 4 British warships. But suddenly, without warning, after only an hour of fighting, San José was torn apart by a massive explosion as its powder magazine detonated. With the 600 crew, only 11 survived, and the ship was sent in pieces to the bottom of the ocean. The ship's log and cargo manifest estimated that she was carrying a mountain of treasure with 7 million Spanish pesos, today worth some $4 billion US. The ship quickly earned the nickname the Holy Grail of Shipwrecks, and efforts were made to find her and secure the gold. In 1981, a private expedition group found the ship lying some 3,000 feet or 914 meters deep. But just when they thought they had become billionaires, the Colombian government stepped in. The wreck was located in their waters and was therefore the property of the nation of Colombia. The expedition team offered a 65-35 split with the government, but it refused. The organization was allowed, after some deliberation, a 5% finder's fee, which was then itself going to be taxed at 45%. They sued the Colombian government for this in 2007, and the Colombian court agreed on a 50-50 split. Then the government refused to act on its own court's ruling. Investors from the original search will never see a cent recovered from the ship. In 2015, the wreck was revisited and located by the Colombian Navy. She was identified by her cannons, which featured prominent engravings of dolphins. The location of the wreck has been classified as a state secret, but released imagery from the sea floor shows thousands of gold pieces of 8 scattered in the silt. In 2015, the Spanish government stepped forward and claimed ownership of the wreck, but since the wreck lies in Colombian waters, there's very little they can do. Some parts of the Colombian government claim the treasure is part of their country's heritage and should be preserved intact in a museum, while others think it should simply be ingested by the nation's bank. Indigenous groups have also come forward demanding a share, since much of the gold had been plundered from their ancestors. Just this month, in November 2023, it was announced that San José is going to be raised before 2026. What exactly the plan is for this historically significant wreck remains to be seen, but hopefully the move isn't just an attempt at recovering the billions in lost treasure, but it will also be a venture aimed at bringing the ship's incredibly preserved artifacts to the public so we can learn more about her colourful past. The whole thing, honestly, is a complete mess, and while minds are still made up and decisions are made over what should actually happen, the Colombian Navy still patrols the wreck, guarding the thousands of gold coins that litter the ocean floor, waiting for anyone bold enough to try and step forward. then take them. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.